In the northern reaches of Maine, dense coniferous forests stretch uninterrupted for miles. Pines, spruces, and firs dominate the landscape, their needles dark green against the muted whites and grays of early winter. The ground, uneven and dotted with rocks, is covered in a patchwork of snow, sometimes crusted with ice, sometimes soft beneath careful footsteps. Streams thread quietly between the trees, partially frozen, their edges decorated with delicate ice formations shaped by wind and temperature fluctuations. The cabin itself is small, constructed of weathered timber, with a single stone chimney rising above the roofline. Its roof bears a thin layer of snow, occasionally falling in small clumps from overhanging branches. Around it, the forest is dense. Visibility is limited to a radius of perhaps 50 meters, creating an envelope of quiet isolation. The only sounds are those of the wind brushing across the treetops and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of ice. Nearby, animal tracks crisscross the snow: deer, rabbits, and the occasional fox, evidence of a forest that continues its cycles largely undisturbed. The light is dim, filtered through a gray sky, and the short winter day offers little warmth. The air carries the crisp scent of pine and frost. Within this setting, the cabin exists not as a spectacle but as a modest presence, aligned with the land rather than dominating it. It is insulated against the wind, but the surrounding forest offers no protection against the sudden drops in temperature that winter can bring. Here, the scale of nature is apparent, and human presence is minimal, contemplative, and measured. The scene is one of quiet observation, of waiting, and of preparation, where survival is dictated by attentiveness to subtle changes in environment and weather. The woman who lived in the cabin, known in local records as Mary Ellen, surname historically documented but withheld for privacy, had moved to this remote part of Maine in the early 1970s. She was in her late 40s at the time of the incident, having spent much of her adult life in rural and semi-wilderness environments. Prior to her life in the forest, she had experience in forestry work and basic carpentry, skills that would prove essential in the months she would later endure. Mary Ellen was not an adventurer in the conventional sense. Rather, she had sought solitude deliberately. Local accounts suggest that she valued the autonomy of living apart from towns and communities, relying on her own knowledge of food, shelter, and seasonal cycles. She had built the cabin herself over several winters, using timber sourced nearby, stacked with care and joined with simple joinery. The structure was small, approximately 25 square meters in interior space, yet thoughtfully planned. The central fireplace was designed for both cooking and warmth, and windows were limited to reduce heat loss during the harsh months. Her life in isolation was methodical. Daily routines were structured around the acquisition of resources, gathering firewood, maintaining the cabin, and monitoring local wildlife for hunting opportunities. Mary Ellen also kept a modest store of preserved food, including root vegetables, dried meats, and grains, stored in a cold, insulated pantry. Water was obtained from a nearby stream, filtered manually, and occasionally melted from snow during the coldest periods. Neighbors recalled that she would occasionally visit the nearest town, several miles away on snow-laden roads, primarily for supplies that could not be sourced locally, such as salt, sugar, or medical necessities. Her understanding of the region was precise. She could navigate the dense forest, predict weather changes, and identify safe and unsafe areas for foraging. Prior to the incident, Mary Ellen had begun preparing for extended periods of potential isolation. In the months leading up to winter, she had built a small insulated enclosure within the cabin, a wooden box roughly 1 meter square. Its walls were lined with additional timber and natural insulation materials. At the time, it was intended for storage or occasional warmth during extremely cold nights, a precaution typical of those accustomed to living in extreme northern climates. By December, the forest had quieted. Snow covered the ground uniformly, and the only movement came from wildlife or the occasional drift of wind-blown debris. Mary Ellen's routine continued uninterrupted, her days governed by light and temperature. The cabin, while small and simple, represented both her independence and her careful attention to practical survival measures. In this environment, every task, every preparation, and every decision had a measurable impact on her continued well-being. On a late December evening, the sky over the forest began to darken earlier than usual. Low, gray clouds thickened, moving slowly from the north. A slight wind rustled through the treetops, carrying with it a hint of snow that would soon accumulate. The temperature had already fallen below -10 degrees Celsius 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cabin's interior, though insulated, reflected the cold creeping through the timber walls. Mary Ellen had completed her routine for the day, stacking firewood near the fireplace, checking her food supplies, and preparing water from the partially frozen stream. She lit the central fire, its small flames casting long shadows across the walls and the simple furnishings of the cabin. The warmth was steady, but the logs burned quickly in the dry winter air. By late evening, the fire began to diminish, its glow softening as the last substantial logs were consumed. Outside, the wind increased, rattling the roof and shaking snow from overhanging branches. The small cabin, which had seemed a haven of solitude and safety, suddenly felt more vulnerable. There was no immediate danger, but the combination of dropping temperatures and limited fuel created a situation that required attention. This was the point when isolation became more than a philosophical state. It became tangible. No neighboring cabin was within walking distance, and the roads leading to the nearest town were not cleared. If the fire died entirely, Mary Ellen would have to rely on her prior preparations and her understanding of the environment to endure the night. The first tension of this winter emerged quietly. It was not dramatic, nor marked by sudden calamity. Rather, it was a subtle shift in circumstance, the realization that the comfort of the day was insufficient for the coming hours. The small wooden box she had built months earlier rested in the corner, unnoticed at the time, but positioned to play a role in what would soon become a test of endurance. By the hour before midnight, the fire was low, leaving only embers. The cold began to creep into the room, not immediately unbearable, but persistent. The forest outside was silent, save for the wind, and the cabin's isolation was complete. In this quiet moment, the boundary between ordinary winter night and survival challenge was crossed, unheralded but unmistakable. As the night deepened, Mary Ellen monitored the diminishing fire with careful attention. She added the remaining small logs to the hearth, but they were sparse, and their burn was quick. The embers glowed faintly, but their heat was limited, barely warming the immediate area around the fireplace. The rest of the cabin, despite its insulation, began to chill steadily as the temperature outside remained far below freezing. Her first response was methodical. She checked her supply of firewood, noting the distance she would need to travel to retrieve more from the surrounding forest. The snowfall from the evening had begun to accumulate on the ground, obscuring the smaller paths she had used for previous trips. The wind pressed against the cabin, and each gust carried snow against the timber walls, creating a soft, relentless draft. Mary Ellen lit the remaining embers with care, attempting to coax a flame from small twigs and pine needles. The process was slow and deliberate. She avoided hurried movements or reckless use of fuel, understanding that conservation was essential. Each bit of warmth had to last, and the limited resources required disciplined management. Throughout the night, she rotated tasks quietly. She adjusted her clothing layers, moved nearer to the fireplace when possible, and inspected the small insulated box she had constructed months earlier. At this point, it became evident that the box could serve as more than storage. It could create a concentrated pocket of heat for her body during periods when the fire could not be maintained. Its position in the corner, against a wall away from drafts, offered protection from the wind penetrating the cabin. Mary Ellen's approach reflected both prior experience and calm observation. She did not panic. She cataloged the resources at her disposal, tracked the hours, and measured the temperature decline. She documented, in her own routine, the patterns of snow drift and wind through the small cabin openings. By midnight, the fire had faded to glowing embers that required constant attention. Even these, however, could not prevent the room from slowly approaching the ambient external temperature. The realization that the primary source of warmth was insufficient was quiet but absolute. Survival now depended on her preparedness, her understanding of insulation, and her ability to remain still and conserve energy. The night, long and unyielding, had become a test of methodical endurance, requiring careful use of tools, environment, and foresight. In the corner of the cabin, Mary Ellen had built a small wooden box, approximately 1 meter square and just over half a meter tall. Its construction was simple. Timber walls reinforced with layers of insulating material she had gathered over the previous months, including moss, dried grasses, and thin sheets of bark. The lid, fitted snugly, could be closed to retain heat, and its interior provided a space where her body could conserve warmth when external temperatures were extreme. The box had been built originally as a precautionary measure. In previous winters, she had experienced nights when the fire burned low or went out entirely, and the box represented an understanding of passive insulation, a controlled space where warmth could accumulate from residual heat and body energy. At the time of construction, she had not anticipated that a night would come when the box would become essential to survival. By the second night of the declining fire, Mary Ellen approached the box deliberately. She added several layers of blankets and clothing, ensuring minimal air gaps. The space was small, but its size was adequate to allow her to lie within and reduce the exposure of her extremities to the cold. Even a single inch of air around the body can significantly increase heat loss, and the box minimized that effect. She spent time observing how heat accumulated within the box. By carefully curling her body and covering her head, she could maintain a temperature noticeably higher than the ambient air of the cabin. The fire, though weak, still provided intermittent warmth, which penetrated the insulated space. With this simple adaptation, Mary Ellen had effectively created a personal microenvironment, a space that allowed survival through periods when fuel and external heat sources were insufficient. This small construction, unnoticed in her earlier routine, became the cornerstone of her endurance. Each time the fire dwindled, she returned to the box, monitored her energy expenditure, and remained within it until conditions improved. The box functioned as both physical shelter and a psychological anchor. This presence allowed her to measure time in small increments, each interval managed with precision. The effectiveness of the box was not dramatic or visible from the outside. There was no sudden warmth or vivid flame. Instead, it was a quiet, methodical adaptation, an embodiment of foresight, understanding of materials, and disciplined preparation. In the silence of the cabin, as snow pressed against the walls and the wind rattled the roof, the small box stood as a testament to human ingenuity applied in isolation, a simple structure that would ultimately make the difference between survival and loss. In the days following the fire's decline, Mary Ellen settled into a strict routine. Survival depended on predictability, and she maintained her daily schedule with precision. Each morning, she checked the remaining firewood and prepared small amounts of kindling for the day's warmth. Fire was rationed carefully, with only the minimal logs needed to maintain embers sufficient for brief heat or cooking. Food management was equally deliberate. Her stores were limited: dried meats, root vegetables, grains, and preserved berries. Portions were measured, and she ate slowly, ensuring that each calorie contributed directly to sustaining body warmth and energy. Water came from melted snow or the nearby stream. She avoided unnecessary exertion to minimize caloric loss. The box in the corner became central to her routine. During the coldest hours, she would spend time inside it, conserving body heat while resting or sleeping. Even when the fire provided some warmth, the box served as a supplemental refuge against drafts and the persistent chill. By alternating periods in the box with brief intervals near the fire, she maintained her core temperature with minimal energy expenditure. Tasks within the cabin were performed quietly and methodically. She repaired small gaps in the walls with moss and bark to reduce drafts, adjusted bedding, and monitored the integrity of her supplies. Any movement outside was deliberate and calculated. Snow and wind made travel arduous, so she limited excursions to essential activities, such as retrieving wood from nearby piles or checking traps she had set for small game. Mental discipline was as critical as physical action. She tracked time and environmental changes, noting shifts in wind, snowfall, and daylight. By maintaining attention to detail, She avoided unnecessary risks and conserved energy. The quiet structure of her day provided a sense of order, countering the potential psychological strain of isolation. Evenings were spent assessing her situation, conserving fuel, preparing water, and readying the box for the night. The repetition of these tasks reinforced a rhythm that became essential for survival. There was no anticipation or dramatization in her actions, only a measured response to the challenges of cold, isolation, and limited resources. Through consistent, disciplined routines, Mary Ellen transformed the cabin from a simple shelter into a controlled environment. Each day, small adjustments, careful observations, and methodical actions allowed her to endure what would have otherwise been life-threatening conditions. In this way, survival was achieved not by dramatic intervention, but by sustained, meticulous attention to detail. As the days lengthened into weeks, Mary Ellen's life in the cabin settled into a cycle of adaptation. The external world remained largely inaccessible. Roads were snowbound, and the dense forest offered little opportunity for rapid travel. Within these constraints, she adjusted her behavior, her environment, and her use of resources to meet the demands of prolonged isolation. Temperature control remained central. The fire continued to provide intermittent warmth, but its duration was limited by available fuel. The box in the corner functioned as a reliable refuge during the coldest periods. Mary Ellen experimented with layering blankets, arranging clothing, and adjusting her body position to minimize heat loss. Small adjustments, such as covering her head and reducing air pockets around her body, produced measurable differences in retained warmth. Her diet reflected a careful balance of nutrition and energy conservation. Food portions were regulated not only to maintain caloric intake but to avoid overexertion during digestion. She supplemented stored supplies with foraged items when possible, though snow and ice limited access. Traps she had previously set occasionally provided small game, but these were treated as supplementary rather than primary sources of sustenance. Isolation also demanded psychological adaptation. Days were marked by repetitive tasks, but she maintained mental clarity by observing the cabin environment, monitoring weather changes, and cataloging the subtle variations in snow and wind patterns. This attention to detail offered a framework for measuring time and maintaining a sense of control. Even minor movements required planning. Mary Ellen rationed physical activity to reduce heat loss and conserve energy. She alternated between periods of activity and rest, ensuring that energy expended was purposeful. This careful pacing reduced the risk of exhaustion and injury. The cabin itself became an extension of her discipline. She continuously repaired gaps in walls, rearranged supplies for efficiency, and monitored the integrity of the box. Each small adaptation contributed to a cumulative effect, enabling her to endure conditions that might have otherwise proved lethal. Through these measures, survival became a process of observation, adjustment, and restraint. The combination of physical management and mental discipline allowed Mary Ellen to maintain health and warmth despite prolonged exposure to extreme cold and isolation. In this quiet, deliberate existence, the forest was both barrier and ally, and the cabin, along with the small insulated box, was central to her continued endurance. During the third week of her isolation, the limitations of the cabin's firewood supply became more pronounced. On several nights, the fire burned to embers and then faded entirely. The temperature inside the cabin approached that of the external environment, hovering well below freezing. Mary Ellen faced extended periods without direct warmth, relying entirely on her previous preparations and the insulated box. These nights were measured in slow increments. She moved deliberately, conserving energy and limiting exposure to cold surfaces. The box provided a confined space where her body heat could accumulate, reducing heat loss. She adjusted layers of clothing and blankets, curling tightly to maintain core temperature. Even small adjustments, tucking extremities close, covering her head, or reducing air gaps, proved significant in retaining warmth. Food and water were rationed carefully during these nights. Eating generated a small amount of internal heat, but overexertion could rapidly deplete energy reserves. She maintained minimal physical activity, performing only essential tasks such as checking water supplies or securing the cabin against drafts. Each action was deliberate and measured, a balance between survival needs and energy conservation. The mental strain was present but subtle. Extended darkness, silence, and limited sensory input could disorient a person unaccustomed to isolation. Mary Ellen countered this by focusing on observable, practical details. Tracking changes in wind patterns, noting the slight shifts of snow on the roof, and monitoring the residual warmth in the box. These small tasks provided both structure and reassurance. Sleep occurred in intervals, punctuated by moments of adjustment when cold began to penetrate the insulated box. She relied on the residual heat from her body and the slight warmth retained from prior embers. While the nights were long and arduous, there was no dramatic struggle. Only the consistent application of preparation, discipline, and adaptation. By the fourth week, it became clear that survival depended on restraint and careful planning. The fire could not be relied upon continuously, and external rescue was uncertain. The combination of insulated shelter, rationed resources, and mental focus allowed her to endure repeated nights of extreme cold, turning what might have been a critical vulnerability into a manageable, controlled challenge. After nearly a month of isolation, Mary Ellen's situation came to the attention of local authorities. Neighbors had noted her absence during routine visits to the nearest town and raised concerns. A search party was organized, moving carefully through snow-laden trails and dense forest to locate the cabin. The operation was methodical, guided by prior knowledge of her routines and the location of the cabin within the remote northern Maine forest. Upon arrival, the searchers observed the cabin's exterior first. Snow had accumulated heavily, partially obscuring the roof and surrounding paths. The chimney was dormant, showing no signs of fire. A careful approach revealed footprints leading to the cabin, some several days old, and the faint evidence of activity near the small box in the corner. Inside, the scene reflected both the severity of the environment and the effectiveness of her preparations. Mary Ellen was found in the insulated box, partially covered with blankets, maintaining core warmth despite the extended period without a full fire. She was alert and responsive, though slightly weakened from rationed food and minimal caloric intake over the previous days. There were no injuries or frostbite beyond minor cold-related discomfort, a testament to her planning and disciplined routine. The rescuers noted the organization of supplies, the careful layering of insulation, and the condition of the cabin, which, though simple, had been maintained meticulously. The firewood supply, though low, had been rationed efficiently, and the interior layout reflected deliberate thought regarding heat retention and energy conservation. The small insulated box, initially intended for occasional comfort, had functioned as a critical survival tool, allowing Mary Ellen to endure temperatures that would have been dangerous otherwise. After assessment, she was assisted out of the cabin and taken to a nearby warming station where her condition could be monitored and stabilized. The process was quiet and procedural. There was no dramatization, no celebration, only careful attention to health and practical steps to ensure recovery. The discovery highlighted the impact of foresight and preparation. Despite extended isolation, extreme cold, and limited resources, survival had been achieved through methodical adaptation and consistent application of prior knowledge. The cabin, the fire, and the small insulated box together created an environment that, though austere, enabled endurance under conditions that would have overwhelmed an unprepared individual. In the quiet aftermath, the story of Mary Ellen's survival became a case study in practical foresight and measured adaptation. The forest, indifferent and vast, had presented no overt threat beyond the natural conditions of winter, yet its challenges were precise: extreme cold, isolation, and limited resources. Her survival was not the product of chance or dramatic intervention, but of consistent, deliberate preparation. The insulated box, small and unassuming, exemplified the principle of redundancy in survival. Initially intended as a minor comfort, it became a crucial element, allowing her to maintain body heat during periods when fire was unavailable. It illustrates how foresight, even in modest forms, can create the margin between endurance and failure in extreme conditions. The disciplined routines she maintained, rationing firewood and food, tracking environmental changes, and organizing the cabin underscore the importance of methodical approaches to prolonged isolation. Each action, measured and deliberate, reinforced resilience against the persistent pressures of cold and solitude. Physical adaptations were complemented by mental discipline. Attention to small, observable details maintained structure and purpose within an environment that could easily erode both. Mary Ellen's experience demonstrates a broader human capacity for adaptation. Isolation, extreme weather, and the limitations of environment test both physical and mental boundaries. In this instance, preparation, experience, and attentiveness transformed vulnerability into manageable conditions. The quiet significance lies not in the drama of survival, but in its demonstration of human ingenuity applied with restraint and foresight. In historical terms, her story adds to the continuum of documented cases where careful planning and disciplined action ensured endurance without intervention. In the forest, the cabin remains unremarkable to a casual observer. Within its walls, however, it is a testament to the measured application of knowledge, the importance of preparation, and the subtle yet decisive role of small adaptations in human survival. It is in this quiet, controlled endurance that the meaning of her experience is fully realized.